Hello and welcome to our Gold Learning viewers. I'm Fiona Lang Sharp, IBCLC Director of Communications and MC for Gold Learning. Well, welcome everyone. Today I have the pleasure of sitting down with Kathleen Kendall-Tackett, who is going to be speaking at our upcoming Gold Perinatal Online Conference 2017. And she's going to be speaking as part of our Trauma Informed Care add-on package. Welcome, Kathy. It's so wonderful to have you back here at Gold.
Thanks so much, Fiona. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, and this is such an important topic. I mean, the whole package, I think, is going to be so significant for our listening audience. And then, of course, having you be part of that package, you can see right here on Kathy's title slide, Adverse Childhood Experiences and Breastfeeding. This is a fairly significant topic, Kathy, and I honestly, I can't wait to hear more. I'm always curious about your research and then suddenly you unfold and tell us all these great things. So I'm excited about it. But before we get into your actual presentation and topic of it, let's start with having you introduce yourself to our listening audience again, and perhaps tell them a little bit about what your day-to-day life looks like today.
Well, I'm a health psychologist in IBCLC, and I own a small press that publishes books in women's health. And my area of research interest, it's actually several things. I'm very interested in perinatal health, but I'm also interested in the impact of trauma, particularly childhood adversity, on adult health. And so that's been something that's been sort of occupying my research life for the last 15 or so years. Because again, trying to kind of understand what are some of those mechanisms. And it's important to kind of look at this in terms of how it impacts breastfeeding, because I think actually it's something that I think actually people a lot of times get wrong, because, I've seen the people in the perinatal health, oftentimes they've discovered that this is an issue. They look at trauma, they look at especially things like childhood sexual abuse. But then I think that they make some leaps because they don't necessarily connect it to the broader literature. And I think actually that's important to do. I've been very active, and I was a founding member of the American Psych Association Division of Trauma Psychology. And I was past president of that. I edit the journal Psychological Trauma. And I think it's actually important that we look at this topic without jumping to some conclusions that are unwarranted, because we need to look at it in the place of the whole trauma field, from a unique sort of perinatal perspective, but also to look at it from a kind of a broader perspective of what else do we know in trauma, because that's the thing that's actually very exciting, is how much research is going on in this field right now. And so what I'd like to do is sort of bring that to the perinatal and to the breastfeeding world.
Yeah, it's so significant. I got all these things whirling around in my head now, Kathy. You've just stirred up a whole bunch of stuff. Yes, absolutely. I can see the significance and, the impact that we potentially have missed for a long time. And I know that you're very dedicated in this field. Can we just back up a little bit? I want to ask you, and I don't know, I mean, I've known you for a long time, Kathy. I don't know if I've actually asked you how you got into this area of lactation. What actually was the driving force behind all of this, going back perhaps a few years ago when you started? But maybe you can reach in and tell us, was there something significant for you? Was it something you fell into? But why your focus in this area?
Well, it actually started for me back in 1983. I was in a master's program in developmental psychology out in California, and I took a summer internship working at a rape crisis center.
Mm-hmm.
And it was kind of back when the child sexual abuse field was just starting to come into being. I mean, it's really weird. It's like I can actually literally go back to almost the very, very beginning in terms of how long I've been in this field. And part of it was, because I was a developmental psych major and not a counseling psych, they actually said, hey, listen, we need somebody to, get educated about, childhood sexual abuse. And they said, would you be willing to go down to San Francisco and get some training? So I said, sure. And so I did. And I went to a great kind of training about it. And then I started doing training sessions in the schools. It was kind of in the early days of, teaching kids about, safe and not safe touch and all that business. But
Right.
I was going in and educating. And then I moved down to the San Francisco Bay Area, and I kind of fell into an internship at the first treatment program for incest in the United States. And they actually, they didn't really quite know what to do with me. So they put me over at the intake. And so I started just talking to people and, doing their intake form for coming into the treatment program. And I went to the director and I said, you're collecting all this great information. We could actually analyze this, and he had actually turned down researchers from all over the world. Said, no, you can't come here and study it. But I kind of, ignored all that and went and talked to him anyway. And I said, look, you got a lot of data here. I said, and you've already collected it. I said,
Right.
you don't actually have to do anything. And so that was actually how I kind of started doing the first studies on it.
Wow.
And from there, it's just, how sometimes just doors open, and
Yeah.
it's like I just kept kind of walking through. And I've always found the topic actually very, very interesting. But it was kind of one of those things that I thought, I feel like I could actually do something in this field, and it's like that was, kind of the motivation. So I did my doctoral dissertation. I did a survey of how people make assessments about whether a child has been abused or not. And so kind of, did a very straight survey methodology, defined a catchment area outside the Boston area, interviewed all the hospitals, police officers, victim witness advocates, counselors working in this area. So we had like 201 specialists. And it was actually very interesting. We got quite a few papers out of that, and
Wow.
so again, like I said, these different sort of opportunities, but
Yeah.
then I became interested in looking at the health effects of it. And that almost started by chance. I actually was just at a grand rounds at our local hospital in New Hampshire, and somebody mentioned something about irritable bowel and child sexual abuse. And I was like, what? And sure enough, I went and looked it up. And in the gastroenterology literature, there were a few studies. There was a guy at North Carolina studying that. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting. And then I became sort of intrigued with that, and tried to kind of understand what were the mechanisms for that, and sat there and kind of like, it took me months. It took me months because it was like they were just starting to understand. It was like in the late 90s, early 2000s, trying to kind of understand that sort of link between the physiology, because we'd always looked at mental health effects.
Right.
And so then we started seeing things, and we found just by chance a connection with past victimization and diabetes.
Mm.
And that's actually, and it was just seemed like such a fluky thing,
Right.
and, I couldn't explain it. I couldn't
Wow.
explain it. I kept I actually sat there and tried to control for all the variables that I thought could account for it, and it was still there. And I thought, okay, this is weird. So then I became kind of more intrigued by, I thought, well, I wonder why. Why does adult, like health, why is it impacted by childhood abuse? What are sort of the lines we can draw? And everybody was always talking about it in terms of behavior. Well, the reason is because they abuse substances, or it's because they smoke, or it's because they overeat, or it's because, and I thought, I don't think that quite captures it. And I really actually don't think that it does. And so it's like
Right.
I tried to kind of work out, and that's where I brought in the health psychology literature. And I worked on this book project that just about killed me in the process. It was published in 2003, and it was looking at
Okay.
those like links. I kind of developed this model
Right.
of sort of 5 factors. So, and again, I'm going to talk about some of those in my talk. So it's not just behavior. It's behavior in its physiology and its emotion and social and cognitive, and all of those factors impact health. And so they're all different pathways. And I actually wrote a paper on it. And originally I had only the 4 pathways. I didn't include a separate one for the physiology. And that paper has actually become my second most cited paper. It's kind of strange. It's when I wrote, it was kind of in the early days of trying to kind of think through these relationships. But that's not something that I'm actually very interested in. And I think that that's where we started talking about it in terms of breastfeeding. To be honest, I didn't actually necessarily want to get into this in terms of breastfeeding, but La Leche League came to me. And they said, we really need you. Yeah, they said, we really want you to talk about this. And I agreed, and then I backed out. And so then I got a call from the gal who was running the conference, and she's like, now listen, we really we need you to talk about this. And she started telling me why, because I told them, it wasn't like I was trying to be stubborn. I just said, there's no research on this. I said, I don't feel comfortable with this. But then when I started hearing what their questions were, and then when I started hearing some of the stuff people were saying, it was just absurd. It made no sense, because it's like, again, I said they'd looked at it just in terms of that little tiny thing that they had seen, but they didn't look at it in the bigger picture in terms of, what do we know about this in general? And we actually, by that time, had a pretty big literature, but I heard ridiculous things. I heard people say stuff like, well, if you have a woman in your childbirth education class who won't lay on the floor, chances are she's been sexually abused. And it
Right.
was like, what? I was like, I
Yeah.
thought, well, chances are she doesn't want to lay on the floor. I mean, it's like, you know,
Isn't it, these sort of it's very interesting, like these preconceived notions that really they're like rumors that have been floating
yeah.
around. It's like the myths of, breastfeeding and the myths of the, how the human body responds. It it may or may not be significant, but like you said, I mean, she just may not want to lay on the floor. I just it is so significant. I hope that you get an opportunity to talk so much more about this during your presentation because just listening to your conversation right now, I am triggered in my brain. It's so fascinating. You do this to me every time, by the way. But
Well, good. I'm glad to hear it.
every time I have a conversation with you, Kathy, you trigger those memories in me to go back and think about my behavior, how I responded, even into my childhood. How do you do that? That's why you do what you do, because you do trigger those responses in me, and I know you do it for many others as well. Well, I hate to cut you off short, but I do need to wrap things up pretty soon here. And I just wanted to ask you just briefly if you could give me one point from your PowerPoint or I'm sorry, from your presentation that you're hoping if there was something that was just really going to trigger people during this presentation or be significant to them in their practice, what would it be? One thing before we wrap things up.
I would say don't prejudge. Take
Love
every
it.
woman exactly where she is. Find out
Perfect.
what she wants to do, and
Yeah.
don't disempower her.
Mm,
Don't. I think that that's probably in some ways the dark side of trauma informed care is like we know a little bit, so then we think,
yeah.
oh, you're not going to want to do this, and it's like find out what she wants to do
Yeah.
and work from there.
Yeah. So significant. So thank you. Wow. Don't judge. I've just written it down on my notepad. Can't hear it enough. In terms of what we're doing and how we practice, because we do judge. We're human beings, so we need to take that step back and rethink the way that we're doing things and relearn some of the practices that we've had in place for many, many years. Thank you so much, Kathy, for being with us here today. It's been wonderful chatting with you here. And thank you to our listening audience for joining us. So again, I just want to remind everyone that our Gold Perinatal Conference is coming up October 2nd, and we have Dr. Kathleen Kendall-Tackett speaking as part of our trauma-informed care package, and she is going to be addressing adverse childhood experiences and breastfeeding. Thank you, Kathy, for joining us.
Thanks so much, Fiona.
Thank you again, everyone, and have a great day. Bye-bye for now.